Today in this video, I'm going to be turning my logo into a Runestone scene in Blender 2.83 and breaking down exactly how I made the scene and my thought process behind it. I've uploaded the project on Gambrell and Patreon, so if you're interested to break it down for yourself and use anything from this project in your own scenes, then feel free to download it from the links given down in the description below. Anyway, let's get started. So I got the idea for this scene from my inspiration board where I collect all sorts of cool reference photos that I find on ArtStation or Pinterest or anywhere online. There was this one that I was really feeling at that time, which sparked an idea in my mind to take my logo and carve it into a runestone. I didn't have much of an idea about how I'd make one, but then I remembered that Gleb Alexandrov had an amazing video which goes over exactly that. That was a great help, which gave me a huge head start with my project in the beginning. Before we dive into the video, I just want to let you know that this is just a breakdown of the things that I did to achieve my result. This isn't a very detailed step-by-step tutorial of any kind. I'll only be going over the major techniques that I used and give you tips and tricks along the way. I took an icosphere and used the bisect tool in edit mode to cut across the sphere and get the basic shape of our stone down. This is actually pretty simple to do after you play around with the bisect tool for a couple of minutes. It was my first time using it like this as well, so it was quite fun and intuitive. After I had the basic shape, I switched to sculpt mode and switched on dynamic topology up here. This will subdivide our mesh based on the settings you've set for it. I had my detail size at 3 and detailing set to relative detail. This allowed me to subdivide the mesh based on the size of the brush and how close I was to the mesh, or the relative size of the brush. Then I just used the scrape and peak brush on the edges of the stone like so, and basically doing that for most of the edges of the mesh. You can also make use of the clay strips brush to quickly add a lot of detail to parts of your mesh, and also use it to add breaks in your edges like I did right here. Don't be afraid to exaggerate some of the details, because when you add materials on it later, most of the smaller details won't be very noticeable. I just had a ton of fun in this part because sculpting with dynamic topology really gives you a lot of freedom, as you don't have to worry about how dense your mesh is and just keep adding more details to it whenever or wherever you want. I also use brushes like the multi-plane scrape to get these hard edges and get interesting shapes very quickly. Now it is time to engrave the logo into our mesh. I used the regular sculpting tools for this part as well. What I did first was that I kind of traced the outline of my logo on the model using a basic brush. Then I had the idea to paint a mask so that I can very easily extrude that part in and get the logo engraved. Since we're using dynamic topology, we can just use a brush like clay strips and paint over the area which we want to subdivide and then later smooth them out. So after I had enough geometry in the area inside the outline, I used a mask brush and did a very dirty painting job inside it. Then I inverted the mask and used a snake hook brush to kind of extrude the mask area in. Since this is really just a stone, you don't need a very clean extrusion. In fact, we're even going to break it up a bit so that it looks more rocky. Now we can smooth out some of the edges and artifacts in this area and move on to the next step. So the next step is even more fun. I used the default brushes to break up our stone and make it look very old and rocky. Using the crease brush, I even added these cracks coming from the logo. Later on, we're also going to add some glow from these areas as well to add some visual interest. For those of you who are wondering if I'm using a tablet for all of this, I'm not. A mouse gets the job done for simple sculpting like this, so I didn't feel the need of a tablet from start to finish, although I think it would have made the process slightly faster. I added a bunch of details on this stone, just cracks and bumps and stuff like that, which make it look much more organic in a way. It's also important to take breaks in between your works, like I'm scrolling through Discord right now, just making sure if my server is doing good. If you're interested to join our server, the link is down below. We've started a monthly art contest with a lot of cool rewards for the winners, so a lot of new people have started coming in and it's just a great time for us. Anyway, back to topic. Once I was satisfied with most of the details, I decided to use some free rock brushes for Blender to add major details on the mesh, and oh my god, these are so high quality that I used them for all of the models in the scene. The best part is that it's all free. Also, if you guys didn't know already, if you go to your brush settings and set the stroke method to anchored, you can just click on a point in the mesh and drag out to control the size as well as the rotation. This is super handy for brushes like these because you can see the effect as you're adding it. So once I had enough details all over the mesh, I was very satisfied with how it turned out. Next, I just placed my stone on a big flat plane and added a camera to to have a rough idea for the composition. I knew that I wanted to go for a symmetrical center shot instead of using something like the rule of thirds because it makes the subject look very intimidating. If you want to know about each of the composition guides in Blender, you can check out the short tutorial that I posted on my Instagram page at HDRIs. So once I had the framing in mind, I started adding the rest of the models in the scene. I started off with the platform where the stone will sit on. I made a very simple block out using cubes. I made the stairs using an array of cubes and then applying the modifier just before sculpting. Again, just the way I did the Runestone, I used the scrape brush and clay strips brush to add the details. Then again, I added those major details by using the free brush pack. It really helped speed up the whole thing. We have our Runestone and platform in place. Now I decided to do the ground. Diving straight into sculpting mode with dynamic topology turned on as always, I used the default brushes to add a bunch of subdivisions in the area that will be visible from the camera. Then instead of painstakingly sculpting the shapes, I used the brush pack directly to add some quick details. At this point, I still had no idea that it would end up being a cave scene, so I'll just let myself loose and added details where it made sense to me, not really worrying much about the location yet. I also added a character that I got off of Mixamo in the scene just as a reference for the scale first, but ended up having him in the final render as a subject because, well, I didn't have anything else for a character. It also helped add a bit of the story as well, so I didn't really regret it. I tried adding trees in the scene, but they look really just bad in this case, so after spending a lot of time working on it to make them look good, I ended up deleting them at the end and decided to work on a cave later. Before working on anything else, I wanted to unwrap the stone and try adding materials to it. Since this model was just a disaster when it came to topology, it was a no-brainer to me that I needed to rely on Smart UV Project to unwrap it instead of doing it manually, as there's no way on earth I'd be bothered enough to try and select the sharp edge loops in a completely triangulated mesh. So yeah, Smart UV Project is the way to go. It actually did a pretty good job and it turned out pretty decent. Now I took this chance to also calculate the texel density of the mesh using the texel density checker add-on for Blender. This add-on remembers the texel density of the last thing you checked, so it becomes very easy for me to unwrap the rest of the stuff later with the same texel density. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, you can watch my previous video where I made a windmill scene in Blender which goes over these topics in a relatively good detail. Similarly, I unwrapped the rest of the objects I had till this point and applied the same texel density to them as well. This may scale up the UV islands beyond the 0 to 1 region, but it's fine in this case because we aren't texture painting anything except the Runestone, which we will get into later, and we're also only going to use seamless tileable textures. I made sure that the Runestone didn't have any islands going beyond the square, otherwise it will lead to tiling when we texture paint, which is obviously not something you'd want when you want to be precise. Moving on, I did some texture painting on the Runestone. I made a black and white texture where the white part would represent the areas which will have an emission shader, which will basically glow. The black part would stay the same. Pretty simple stuff, just paint on your model directly or paint on a 2D UV islands if that's something that you prefer. After you're done, just make sure to save it somewhere on your computer, otherwise it'll be lost when you reopen Blender. To set up the glow, we can use a mix shader to mix the principal shader, which will have our rock textures connected, with an emission shader. We're going to use the texture we just made as a factor for the mix shader, and then we can control the strength and color of the light by changing the values inside the mission node. For the actual material of the stone part, I first masked out the sharp edges of the stone by using the pointiness output of a geometry node and using a color ramp to tweak it. After some texture hunting online, I found a texture that worked very well with the look I wanted for it, so I added that in by selecting the principal shader and pressing Ctrl-Shift-T and then selecting all of the textures. This automatically created a PBR material for us. I used the edge mask to exaggerate the sharpness of the stone, which also looks like a bit of edge wear that you see on rocks. I also changed the displacement in the material settings to displacement and bump so that the material utilizes the height map to displace the geometry of the mesh and give us even more details. For the rest of the materials in the scene, I followed similar techniques. I also inverted the pointiness output to get the mask for the crevices and then used that mask to add some moss in the material. I wanted to work a bit on the lighting next because I felt that the major models were already made, so I added a huge cube to the scene with a volume scatter node connected to the volume socket of the material output. This will introduce volumetrics in our scene to which the light will react. For this scene, I played around with the values and settled on a very low density like 0.1 or 0.05 at the end. Then I messed around with a few lights and seeing what worked and what didn't. I still had the forest look in mind, so I was lighting accordingly. I quickly realized that it would look very monotone if the scene didn't have any contrasting lights, so I thought of making some Japanese shrines along the edge to give the scene a warm look so that the stone in the middle would contrast it very nicely. It started off as a cube which I turned into a basic shrine model. Then again, the same workflow of sculpting with dynamic topology on, creasing, denting, smoothing, and adding details using the brush pack. After all of that was done, I tested if it would actually work in the scene by adding some point lights in the shrines, and I was actually really glad that it looked pretty much the same that I thought it would look like. So I instanced them to all of the shrines to complete it. I also added the materials for the shrines in the same way I added it for the stone, with the edge mask, displacement, and all that good stuff. After that, I decided to add the particle system for the grass. I used the grass and flowers pack that I found on Blend Swap for this. I'll leave a link to this in the description. So I added a particle system with the render as set to collection and instance collection set to collection with the grass models. I weight painted some areas near the shrines and the stairs mostly, but also in some random parts of the middle area of the ground with a low weight. I used a vertex paint to control the density of the particle system to get the particles appearing only in those areas. Now, one oopsie that I did in the final render was that I increased the amount of particles at the end, which also introduced a lot of those flower models into the scene, which is actually pretty unrealistic if you think about it. There would be no way that a flower would grow so nicely inside a cave because there is no sunlight. Well, that's something to keep in mind for future. I'm just letting you know in case you want to recreate this. Next up, I wanted to fix a problem with the shrines, and that is they're emitting light without any fire in them. And I knew that a fire simulation would actually start a fire in my house, so I just looked for torch flame overlays on Google and found this image that works very well. I added it in using the import images as planes option, which is only available if you have the add-on enabled. This let me quickly import the images with the proper dimensions and the basic emission material setup, so it was just a matter of positioning and scaling it properly. Then I duplicated the plane to all the appropriate places. To make it look unique each time, I scaled, rotated, and positioned it in different ways. I also went to edit mode and deleted the floating particles off of most of the meshes because it could easily be noticed when we duplicated all over the scene. Now, with all of that done so far, this is what the scene looked like. This is the point when I asked for suggestions from my artist friends online because I knew it could be much better than just trees. They gave me the idea of having it inside a cave, which gave me a really good idea for the lighting as well. So moving on, I deleted the trees and started making the cave. I started off with a cube, deleted the ends and the bottom faces, and headed straight into sculpting. I used the basic brushes to add some slight bumps and subdivisions first, and also to smooth out the rough edges of the cube, and then utilized the realistic stone brushes that I had to add all of the details on the cave. This is the part that was the easiest to do, yet the coolest looking. So after making the first part of the cave, I duplicated it, moved it forward, and scaled it up. To make it look different than the original one, I added subtle variations to the shape by using the grab brush as well. After that, I headed over to edit mode and selected and deleted the faces which I wanted to remove for the sunlight to come through it. To blend it a little better, I also added some more details around that area to make it look more solid. Next up, I wanted to fill the scene, mainly the background, with some more details to add some more depth to the scene. So I added a plane, made the super basic block out of a stony ground, I guess. This, with some sculpting, became this rocky thing which I put far away from the camera, which made the scene seem larger. Finally, since the models didn't have any textures or materials on them yet, I had to unwrap them using Smart UV Project like before, and then apply the same textile density to keep it consistent. Then I used a different rock texture for them, but kept the moss and edge wear setup the same. And that is all the modeling that we have done. Now, I suppose the lighting here is a bit tricky or hacky to say the least. I used a sun lamp to get the beams entering the cave from the opening on the top to control the strength and color of the light. I turned on use nodes with the light selected and added a black body node to the color input of the emission shader. This node is used to convert the black body radiations into color data, so I used a temperature of 5800 Kelvin for a slightly warm color. This can be considered physically accurate according to this table I found on Wikipedia while reading about black body emissions. Note that this only works in cycles as far as I'm aware. The volumetrics in our scene that we added earlier seemed to work just fine for the god rays that I was expecting. However, I needed to fake the highlights on the stone by adding 2 aerial lights beside it. I also added an HDRI in the world lighting nodes to get some lighting from the back, which would otherwise just look like an abyss. And that's pretty much how I took my logo and turned it into a Runestone scene. I think I had a bit too much fun with this one because it took me about a week to make. But the best part is that I was able to compress the whole experience into this little video. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video and or learned something new from it. If you did, then make sure sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this in the future. Also, the link to download this project are given in the description along with some other stuff like my Instagram, Discord server, etc. Speaking of which, remember how I mentioned the contest earlier? It's still going on and the deadline for joining is 11th August, so you still have enough time to show off your creative skills and win awesome rewards. I want to thank the creators who helped me with this contest by sponsoring it with their products. Iyad Ahmed, also known as CG on Fire, Rahul Parihar or Doublegum, Dorian Bormans, otherwise known as BD3D, Josh Gambrell and Ponte Ryuurui, and Jonathan Lampel from CG Cookie. I have a link to all of their products in the description. If you don't have time for the contest, I would still recommend checking out their products because they have some amazing stuff which will definitely help you speed up or even add a lot to your workflow. And finally, I want to thank my Patreons, Master Zeon1001, Marion Mayer, Max Chandler and Trelligan for their invaluable support, and also thanks to everyone who has watched till this point. I really appreciate your support. So yeah, that's it for today. Thanks for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one.